Hey guys, it's Lamont from Days of French and Swedish, and it's my honour and privilege to have to be joined by Matt from Matt versus Japan YouTube channel and from the Mass Immersion Approach. So I've just got some questions for him, and that's what we're going to do.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for being here. So I was curious about you've been into Japanese for a really, really long time. Well, not a really, really long time, but quite a number of years, a lot longer than most people give to one language. And for a lot of that time, you've studied it really hardcore. And I was just wondering how you kind of stayed motivated for that whole time, and were there any periods that you just sort of felt like you were going to give it up, or maybe you dropped off and you got interested in something else? And did you ever have to sit down and kind of go, no, if I want to do this, I need to be really deliberate about this?
Yeah, well, so I guess just to preface this for anyone who doesn't already know my backstory, so I have been engaging with Japanese for pretty much 10 years now, and out of those 10 years, 5 of those were spent in almost full-time, very dedicated, intensive study with very little breaks in between. And so I'm kind of gauging that's what you're asking about, right? For those 5 years, when I really went from almost nothing to pretty much near the level I'm at today, how did I maintain that motivation, that kind of single pointed, effort? And really, I think it has to do with the kind of psychological factors that are involved with why I was curious about Japan in the first place. And I've talked about this elsewhere before, but I think basically when I was in high school, which is when I very first became interested in Japanese, I wasn't on the upper end of the social hierarchy that most people perceive to exist within, that age group of humans. And for my ego, this was just really upsetting. I couldn't deal with the fact that I was a loser and not a winner. I just couldn't take it. And so I think this was really at the root of why I was so inspired to learn Japanese, because when I first became exposed to Japanese culture, which just happened to be through anime, I kind of came up with the story without realizing this is what I was doing. But what part of my mind was doing was creating the story that, Japan is way better than America in pretty much every way. And so if I just forget about America and go to Japan and I'm a winner over there, I'm at the top of the social hierarchy over there, well, then I'm really the one on top, because the entire Japanese social hierarchy exists on top of the entire American one. And this was going to be my way for my ego to redeem itself and not be a loser. And this was really at the foundation of my whole relationship with Japanese. And so this led me to hyper focus on the aspects of Japanese culture which were positive and completely ignore the aspects which were not so positive. And I just really took to heart this idea that I was going to go to Japan and live the rest of my life as a Japanese person. And of course, a part of that was I had to be really good at Japanese. And once I really internalized this idea, I didn't really question it, because my entire worldview rested upon this story. And so it was actually kind of dangerous for me to question it, right? My entire approach to life could crumble if this premise was removed. So I just never questioned it, even to the extent that when I studied abroad and had a pretty nasty experience in Japan, after I came back home, I still couldn't really seriously consider the idea that maybe I should go in a different direction, because I had already put all of my, all my resources and all my time in this one place. And so for me, for that 5-year period, there really wasn't any issues with motivation. There wasn't really any times where I was like, I don't feel like it, but I got to do it, because it was really almost an existential issue for me. And because of that, I had this really strong motivation. And it was after 5 years, when I started to kind of wake up to the more negative aspects of Japanese culture, that I started to realize what I had been doing. And it took me a while to kind of change my relationship with Japanese, so into a more healthy one, really. But yeah, for that 5-year period, I think it was due to this interesting circumstance. I didn't really have a problem with motivation. And I also view that as one of my kind of, one of the things that I lack as someone who's in the position of helping other people learn foreign languages, because I actually have heard you talk about this on your channel a little bit, that, yeah, motivation and putting kind of systems in place that help you stay consistent is really one of the biggest reasons that people struggle with learning a language. Like if you know all the right techniques, but you can't actually execute them, then they're not useful to you. And this is something I feel like experientially I didn't have to deal with that much. And so I'm not as equipped to help other people deal with that issue.
Well, I'm really glad you said that, actually, because that's exactly why I asked you that question. And by the way, I realized that I've actually asked these questions out of the order that I sent you them in. So I've thrown Matt a curveball there accidentally, but he's dealt with it really well. Hit it out of the park, actually. But yeah, no, I'm really glad you brought that up, because that's what I couldn't, like, when I was watching your channel, I was like, this content is amazing, but like, how could you possibly do this? Like, if I were to put that much effort into either of my languages, being Swedish or French, and obviously much, much closer to English, like, I would sound amazing in those languages. But I talk about motivation on my channel a lot, but I struggle with this stuff like a lot. Like yesterday, I only did an hour of one of my languages, and to me that's like a bit of a fail day. So you're saying that you actually had quite an kind of an unhealthy beginning to this journey, but that kind of worked out for you quite well.
Yeah, luckily, like in hindsight, of all the things I could have been really obsessed with, I'm glad it was Japanese instead of some video game or something like that, or doing something illegal or something like that. So ultimately it did work out pretty well. So I'm lucky in that regard. But if you look at, what was my motivation, it was a very unhealthy motivation relationship that I had. But I'll also just note that now that I'm learning Chinese, I'm dealing with, just like what you said, I also a lot of days will spend almost no time with Chinese and have all these mundane struggles that most of the adults in the world trying to learn a language experience. And so it's very much also a continual learning process for me as well. And
Sure.
it's definitely not easy.
Yeah, sure. Okay, actually, on that, so we'll go back to the first question that I did send you, which was that when you first started watching anime without dubbing, you said that you just really liked the sound of Japanese. You just thought it sounded beautiful. And I think a lot of people can agree with you on that. I think it sounds great. But I actually think that basically all languages that I don't understand sound amazing. Some of them sound, a little bit harsh, but all of them sound at least interesting to me, if not positively gorgeous. Like Finnish, for example. I think it's just like silk on your ears. But I don't understand any of those languages, and I find that the more I understand of them, the less I think they sound beautiful, because the more meaning they entail. And I just wondered if that's been your experience with Japanese. I mean, now that you understand almost everything you hear in Japanese, do you still think it sounds beautiful?
So I still think it sounds beautiful in certain ways, but not in the way that I initially thought it did, where, when I very first was getting exposed to Japanese, listening to it for the first time, there was a certain musicality to it. It was almost like the sound of a certain instrument that just inherently is pleasing to the ears. And in that sense, I can't experience Japanese that way anymore. And in fact, I can barely remember what it sounded like to me back then. I can just slightly, but not really. But so now it's like a beautiful Japanese sentence sounds beautiful, and sometimes there's just someone with a very nice voice. I like the sound of their voice, but there's other people with a voice I don't really like, or there might be things they say that it's very dependent on the content, right? Some people speak in a vulgar way that's not as pleasing. Some people speak in a very refined way that is pleasing. So it's more similar to, well, it's pretty much the same as how we experience our native language, right? Like beautiful language sounds beautiful, but
Yes.
only a subsect of the language. Like if you're just looking at the way it's used across the whole population, right? Only a subsection of that would be considered, well, I would personally find beautiful,
Yeah. Well, I think it's a scale. So there are still Swedish speakers who sound really beautiful to me, but that's generally because they have an intonation and sort of a way of flowing their words onto one another that I can't replicate. But for the people whom I feel like I can replicate a little bit more, I generally don't find them beautiful. But I think what I'm saying is I kind of lost this with English, at least. Like I wouldn't know how to hear if someone's the way someone reads something, like say a professional narrator or something. I wouldn't know how to judge whether it sounds beautiful, because I'm just so focused on what they're saying.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. I mean, I definitely feel like in English, there's some people who I just like the way they talk. Maybe separate from the content, like just the tone of their voice and the type of intonation patterns they use is just soothing to the ears.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I think it's fundamentally different than the raw musicality that you experience when listening to a language that you don't actually understand. But I still think to a degree, like, sometimes you listen to an audiobook and it's just like, wow, I like the sound of this voice.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So given that, so on the back of that we've just discussed, would you say that pronunciation, and especially pitch accent, which is kind of, I feel like you've got a bit of a reputation for pitch accent because you're one of the only Americans who's kind of done it quite well, I guess, who's put the time in to master it almost. Would you say that it's easier to work on that before you can actually understand the language, like before studying the grammatical aspect of the language?
No, I wouldn't really say so, because when you first start, as an adult, when you first start listening to a foreign language, which you haven't really spent a lot of time listening to, there's going to be a lot of sounds in that language which you probably can't perfectly perceive, right? Like we know through linguistic studies that when an infant is first born, they're able to differentiate between all the different vowels and consonants which exist in every known human language. But by the time they reach around 9 months of age, they become able to only differentiate the sounds that exist in their native language, or their native languages in the case of a infant that's being brought up bilingually. And so, for example, one easy example that I've used on my channel before is that most Japanese people cannot perceive the difference between L and R in English. So if I said right or light, they literally sound like the same word. And in fact, to them subjectively, it doesn't really sound like an L or an R. It kind of sounds like the Japanese R, which is not really either of those. And so we can imagine a Japanese person trying to work on English pronunciation at the beginning of their studying English without really being able to understand very much. They are going to experience English in that kind of raw musical sort of way which we were just talking about. But part of that experience is that they're actually not hearing all the distinctions that are necessary to pronounce the language like a native. And when I make this argument, a lot of people are like, oh, well, I speak Spanish and I'm learning Japanese and there's no sounds in Japanese which don't exist in Spanish, so I'm fine. Now, on a very rough overview level, that might be true, especially if you're just worrying about, can I be understood when I try to pronounce a sentence? But if you're talking about trying to have a native-like accent, then really there's no equivalencies between any language. Like, even if you're talking about the International Phonetic Alphabet and you say like, oh, French and German both have this same letter in the International Phonetic Alphabet, it's slightly different, right? Your tongue might be 1 millimeter further back in French than in German. I don't know the specifics, but really they're all different. They're just similar enough that whoever invented the International Phonetic Alphabet was like, okay, we'll just say that they're the same for the sake of this system that we're building, but it's ultimately arbitrary. And so, when you're learning a language, you're probably going to hear the similar sounds as if they were the same as they are in your native language. And you're going to mimic them that way. And so I'd say, for the most part, the more you listen to a language, the better your brain's going to get at perceiving all the different nuances in the sounds. And to that extent, you're going to have more success mimicking them. And in the case with pitch accent in particular, most people, when they first start studying Japanese, or I should preface this with most English speakers, when they first start studying Japanese, they can't hear the pitch accent. So, I could say the same sentence twice, but just swap out the pitch accent of one word. Like, some famous, one famous example of pitch accent is rain versus candy, where besides the pitch accent, they sound exactly the same. It's the same vowels and consonants. So if I said like ame ga furimasu, should be it rains, and ame ga furimasu, it would mean candy's falling from the sky, basically. Most people wouldn't be able to really tell which one was which out of context when they first start studying Japanese. It's something they have to train. And so I think at the beginning, it'd be hard for you to really fully grasp pitch accent because you don't have any ability to hear it with any high level of nuance. Now, of course, there's always exceptions, like people who are trained musicians sometimes are able to hear it pretty well from the start. If you speak a tonal language like Chinese, you might be able to hear it pretty well from the start. But for the most case, this isn't true for most people. Mm-hmm. And so there's that. The other thing is that with pitch accent in particular, the pitch accent of words changes a lot depending on what grammar structure they're being used in. And that there can be higher level rules. And so to a certain extent, it's almost impossible to really understand the nuances of pitch accent without already knowing grammar, because if you don't understand how verbs conjugate, how can you understand how pitch accent changes when verbs conjugate, right? It's kind of like a higher level thing. But with all that said, I think there might be one area where you could say that someone who hasn't heavily studied a language is in some way at an advantage when it comes to pronunciation, which is in the area of connected speech. So connected speech is something that I've talked about on my channel before, where when native speakers are speaking their language, a lot of times sounds get blurred, get removed, get switched out for other sounds in order to make it easier to speak quickly and naturally. So, for example, in English, we often will say like, don't you want to go, instead of don't you want to go. And that don't you becomes like don't chew. And so there's this like ch sound that gets inserted out of nowhere. Mm-hmm. And so there's all these very complicated sound changes that happen when natives link words together in a natural way. And my experience has been that this kind of sound changes due to connected speech is one of the kind of final barriers to truly achieving a native-like accent in a foreign language. And when you listen to very high-level second language speakers of English who have a very good accent, a lot of times the thing that gives it away that they're not actually a native speaker is that they pronounce too many sounds. Like they might actually say like, don't you want to go to the store or something, instead of don't you want to go to the store. And even if the individual vowels and consonants are completely perfect, it still sounds weird because native speakers wouldn't properly pronounce every single like syllable like that. And I think why this is so hard to achieve is because when you learn the language and you learn how to read and you internalize the system of language consisting of words, and words kind of being this indivisible unit of meaning, then that affects your perception and you start to hear spoken language in terms of words as well. And so even though someone might say, don't you want to go, you hear, don't you want to go in your head, because that's how your brain has to break it down in order to comprehend it. And so there's kind of this filter where even though really they're saying, don't you want to go, you actually subjectively experience it as a bunch of individual words. And so when you try to repeat it back out, you might be accidentally adding in those sounds back, even though they weren't really there. And this is due to actually having a model in your head of how the language works, right? So the fact that you have knowledge is actually affecting your perception in a negative way. And in a way, I think the only way to overcome this is basically to train yourself to actually listen for what vowels and consonants are being pronounced separate from meaning. And I think a good metaphor for understanding this is there's this pretty famous book about learning how to draw called Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain that a lot of people watching this have probably heard of. And in that book, the author talks about how the reason why a lot of people seem to be bad at drawing is because when they attempt to draw something, they're not actually drawing what they're seeing in front of their eyes. Instead, they're kind of drawing a model of what they think the object looks like inside of their head. So like if they're trying to draw an apple, they're not really looking at what is the contour of this apple that is in front of my face. They just have this idea, oh, apples are round, so I'm going to draw it round and things like that. And so there's this interesting exercise that the book gives where if you try to draw a picture of someone's face, and you're not a very experienced artist, probably isn't going to look very good. But if you take that same picture of someone's face and you flip it upside down so that their chin is facing up and their eyes are like at the bottom, and then you try to draw it, you'll instantly draw a much more accurate picture, because when the face is upside down, it kind of interferes with your brain's ability to see it as just a face. And instead it just looks like a bunch of parts. Like it's just a lip and a nose and an eye, or maybe just a bunch of lines. So it forces you to actually look and say, what am I actually perceiving? And go beyond the level of the concept of it's a face and faces look like this, and just go, what lines am I perceiving right now? And that's the key to being good at drawing. So I think in the same way, the key to acquiring native speech is to gain that ability to kind of metaphorically turn the picture upside down and hear like what vowels and consonants are they saying separate from what words I think they're saying. And this can be difficult to do, but this is actually something that meditation has helped me do, because a lot of meditation is about gaining more control over your attention, so you can learn to really hone into certain aspects of your experience. And so there is that. So you could say, in a way, someone who's never studied the language before, they're not going to have these preconceived notions regarding how the language is broken up into words. But overall, you're at such a disadvantage due to the first thing I talked about with your lack of perception, that I don't really think there's any way to effectively make use of the fact that, you know, you don't have these preconceived notions. So I think ultimately it's still going to have to be a process of acquiring the language to a high level, and then going back and training yourself to not get caught up in the boundaries of words and things like that. And the other thing is, to really do that, you also have to be able to accurately hear what vowels and consonants are being pronounced, which again, a beginner wouldn't be able to do.
Yeah, so I completely agree with you, and that was an awesome answer, like a comprehensive answer. The reason I asked that, or like one of the kind of founding things for my asking that, is that sort of when I was maybe first getting into Swedish, maybe 18 months in, I have a friend, and he said that he has never ever met a non-native Swede who sounded like a native. And like Swedes have, that's a big what do you call it, like pool of study, because Sweden has a ton of immigrants, so he's got a lot of people he knows who are non-native Swedes, and none of them sound like natives to his ears. And I asked another guy who's a Swedish teacher, and he said that he'd met one in his whole life. He's like 35, and he had met one person who studied Swedish as a second language and ended up sounding like a native. He was a German guy, and he said that this guy listened to Swedish in the car for like a year straight before studying a single thing about the language. And it probably sat there and like mimicked the intonation as best he could, which like, and a German would be able to understand a decent amount of Swedish, certainly not to like a comprehensible level, but enough that they could pick up on certain words and stuff. But yeah, I just kind of found that interesting, that this one person in this like probably fair amount of people who ended up sounding like a native was someone who kind of took it maybe top down, or took a backwards approach of like...
Yeah. Well, actually, I've heard some similar reports. Like, there's this one Chinese guy who's really good at English, and he almost sounds like a native speaker. I mean, there's some weird quirks about his speech, but if you're just talking about pronunciation, he doesn't sound Chinese at all. And he apparently listened to some half an hour clip of English like thousands and thousands of times. Yeah. And I've heard a couple other reports here and there of a similar thing. So maybe, like, when I hear that kind of story you just explained about that German guy, I think it's maybe not necessarily that he was trying to produce the sounds from the beginning, but maybe just the fact that it took him a year of training his listening. But the fact that he did that listening training in a sort of isolated condition without adding on concepts about grammar and vocabulary and things like that, maybe that's the key, because then you're getting all the benefits I was talking about, where you do have to put in a lot of hours to be able to become able to hear all the nuances in the sound, but then you're not laying all this kind of baggage on top about how this language is broken up into words, and that interferes with you perceiving connective speech. So I could kind of see that, and I'm curious about that strategy. I've kind of always wanted to try that in a foreign language, but it's also something that's very difficult to commit to, you know, to just listen for a year without learning anything.
Yeah.
You have to take a very long-term strategy, but I really admire that as someone who tries to reach very high levels in foreign languages.
Yeah, and I mean, anything that you're saying is difficult to commit to, and that you really admire must be like pretty hardcore, because like I would think most people would agree that your strategy, at least for Japanese, was pretty hardcore. Speaking of which, would you agree that an input-based approach, so for those not familiar, an input-based approach is based on this theory that is generally accepted to be correct, that it speaking, certainly from an early stage, is not actually the most efficient way to go about learning a language, and can even be harmful, because Matt describes it much better than I do, but basically, so we're talking about listening to the language and reading a lot from an early stage, even to like for quite a while, like maybe even 6 months or a year or even longer than that. So that was kind of your approach to Japanese, is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
And would you agree that that is not the easiest thing to sell beginners? And when I say beginners, I mean people who have not studied a foreign language before, or have at least not had success in a foreign language before. Would you agree that that's not the easiest thing to sell them on?
Oh yeah, totally. Of course, it's definitely hard to sell, but it's kind of like similar to how if we think about health, right? There's a lot of people in the health industry saying like, oh, if you just do my diet program, that's super easy. Or, hey, if you just do my exercise program for 5 minutes a day, then you can lose all the weight you want and be really healthy. It's like, that's easy to sell because it's a delusion, right? The reality is much harsher. Like most people aren't very motivated when they just hear like, yep, diet and exercise and be consistent and it's going to work, right? That everyone wants an easy solution. So I think it's the same thing with language learning, right? Like I think telling people like, yep, just listen to the language for 10,000 hours and do some study on the side. It's equivalent of saying like, yep, diet and exercise, just good old fashioned hard work. And so, yeah, it's not hard to sell. It's going to be much easier to sell people the idea that they can just download some app and play a game on their phone for 10 minutes a day. And then that's going to get them to their goal. So yeah, it's definitely hard to sell, but I think it's kind of like, that apply to most areas in life where you're trying to achieve a significant result, you know?
Yeah. So like Gary Keller, from the author of The One Thing, he says that like if you want an extraordinary result, you are going to need to take extraordinary measures. Like it's not brain surgery, right? But I guess what I'm kind of coming back on that with, or not arguing, but yeah, but like pushing back against, is that that's not at all how I got into Swedish. And if someone had tried to sell me on that in Swedish, in theory, I might be a better Swedish speaker today, which wouldn't even be that hard, but I probably wouldn't speak any Swedish at all because I wouldn't have gotten into it at all. So I, like one of these first kind of online polyglots, language learning people that I discovered was Benny Lewis. And these days I disagree with a lot of stuff that Benny says, but I still have him to thank for the fact that I'm even interested in language learning at all, because he goes the complete opposite. For anyone not familiar with Benny Lewis, he's like, you just speak from day one. So like if konnichiwa is the only thing I can say in Japanese, then you just say that until the other speaker suggests something else for you to say, or whatever it is. And that's basically how I started Swedish. And it kind of worked in that I stayed motivated enough to now speak the language with some degree of fluency. Do I sound like Matt in Japanese? No. But yeah, that's kind of my question, is that like, is there any wisdom to approaching it in a more sellable kind of way?
Yeah, well, this is an idea that I've become more and more open-minded to over time, because when I first started making YouTube content, I was a little bit of an elitist. And, I was young when I started this, so hopefully people can not hold me against, they can not hold this against me too much. But like, yeah, I was definitely kind of an elitist who had this mindset of like, if you want results, like suck it up and do the hard work. And if you're not willing to do that, then I'm not interested in you. Whereas now I'm just realizing that if I say that my goal is to help as many people as possible meet their language learning goals, then that mindset is definitely not the most effective way to achieve that. It's just going to alienate lots of people, and then no matter how much wisdom I have, they're not going to listen to it, so it doesn't matter. And so now I'm slowly coming around to realizing that this is a very valuable thing to think about, because if people quit early on, or they're not willing to try out what you're saying, then really it doesn't matter how much value you have to offer, because no one's going to listen to you. And like a similar concept is in meditation circles, because meditation, I saw you might ask a question about meditation later on, but like meditation is one of my other passions. And in hardcore meditation circles, well, I shouldn't say it as if it's a big thing, but there's one kind of meditation forum that I used to go on a lot, and they would talk about how to trick muggles into meditating. and get them to this point where they would have enough direct experience where they would be willing to get more serious about it because they'd see the value in it. But the hard part is, how do you get people to that point where they see the value in their own experience, so they're really willing to take things to the next level? And I just thought that word of like muggles was really funny because it kind of applies. It's also very condescending because we're saying that we are the enlightened ones who know magic. But, to say to the uninitiated, right? How do you get them to be open-minded to these ideas which are counter to everything that you've probably heard up until now when it comes to language learning? And I think that speaking is definitely very useful for this particular purpose. Like, I know in Chinese, every once in a while when I'm at a Chinese restaurant or something, I have a chance to speak just a little bit that I know, and they understand me, and my family's all impressed and stuff. Like, it feels very motivating. It just feels really awesome. Like, wow, I just communicated with someone who I wouldn't have been able to communicate with at all if I hadn't studied the little bit that I studied. And it naturally makes you feel like that you want to get more serious and take things farther. So definitely think maybe regularly doing italki lessons or something might have a sort of pragmatic utility in that sense. And also, I mean, and I should also just say that this is something I think needs to be explored more. I don't have any conclusions, but just the ideas that I have at the present moment are that also I think it's important to actually have people understand the theory behind language acquisition and understand why the things that work, or at least our hypotheses regarding why the things that work. Because once you really have the kind of behind the scenes understanding of what's going on when it comes to language acquisition, you're going to be able to very quickly sort the wheat from the chaff and say, oh, well, this doesn't make any sense when you really think from a higher level point of view of how language acquisition works.
Yeah.
And so I think just having an actual solid intellectual understanding of how these things work can create motivation, because you know that at least you have good reason to believe that these techniques are going to work. But one problem with this is that some people aren't interested in learning about detailed, nuanced, high-level abstract ideas, and so it's very hard to sell that to some people. That's an issue I've been dealing with, and so there's that. Another thing is just easing people into getting a lot of input in the language, like having them start off with just 20 minutes a day. If you can build a habit of spending 20 minutes watching a TV show in your target language, even with native language subtitles, right? That's a good start, and you can slowly build it up from there. So I like the idea of using native language subtitles to start, because at least that makes it into an enjoyable kind of stress-free activity.
Yeah.
But yet you're still exposing yourself to your target language. And if you're also doing study on the side, like even if you're just learning a couple words a day, but then you watch like one episode of a TV show in your target language with English language subtitles, you'll probably start noticing that you can pick out the words that you learned, and that's probably going to be motivating. So yeah, those are just some kind of scattered thoughts, but it's definitely an issue, I think, that needs to be explored more.
Well, I think some people are like, I'm going to call them tire kickers. Like they say that they want to learn the language, and it wouldn't actually matter what you said to them. Like you could even say, like, for some people, even the Duolingo streak is not enough to keep them motivated. They're like, oh, I lost it after like 13 days, and then I just that killed my motivation. I'm like, well, if that killed your motivation, then like I can't see you ever doing anything that will actually work, because your streak wasn't going to work. So if even just losing that killed your motivation, then I can't see you ever doing anything more hardcore than that. And so I think some people find channels like yours and mine, and they're like, they subscribe because they like the idea of learning a language, but at this stage in their life, they're not actually ready to commit to it. And they're just like tire kicking, just like someone buying a car who's not actually going to buy the car. You just kind of want to pretend that you're interested in buying the car.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I totally agree with you. This is a big issue for a lot of people, but I think it completely goes beyond language learning.
Yeah.
And it's kind of just the phenomenon of a New Year's resolution, right? Like, this year I'm going to get in shape, or this year I'm going to learn how to play the guitar, or anything like that. Starting a big long-term project, which doesn't regularly give you, those big dopamine boosts, that doesn't play to your internal reward system as well as clicking around on the internet, is hard for a lot of people to get engaged in. And so I think the solution, the fact that the problem goes beyond language learning, suggests that probably the solution will be something not specific to language learning as well. And I think this is something that you are talking about on your channel, and I want to explore more as well. But like maybe like learning more about building habits in general and learning more about motivation in general might be the key to solving this kind of fundamental issue.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'll ask you the question about meditation now, because I think that ties into what we're just talking about. I kind of see language learning for me as like a way of centering myself. Like when I don't really have any plans for my day and I feel like it's getting towards 10:30, 11 o'clock and the day's kind of slipping away from me, I haven't achieved anything. At the very least, I can go and get an hour of French input or Swedish input or more. And that always kind of kickstarts me into like, okay, now I've done something. I can go on and do more. Like I can be productive and do that thing that I actually need to do. And like for you, your other passion, this might be unrelated really, but your other passion is meditation. To what extent do you feel that meditation aided your Japanese learning? And do you feel like it's kind of a certain meditation about learning a language at the same time? Like, do you feel like there's a meditation involved here?
Well, for me personally, meditation played a really big role in me changing the relationship that I had to Japanese, because like I talked about it in the beginning of this conversation, I started off with a really unhealthy relationship to Japanese. And basically what happened was I was completely enamored with Japanese culture to a very like irrational degree, where I was completely ignoring all the negative aspects of the culture, hyper focused on the positive aspects. And so when I finally kind of snapped out of this mindset and started to view things as they were, I almost kind of had my internal pendulum swing to the opposite side, where I could only see the negative aspects of the culture, and I couldn't see the positive aspects of the culture because I was almost so disgusted about how deluded I was for so long. And another component of this was that around the time that I first started to break out of my old paradigm, I was going to college, and there was a big community of Japanese people at my college. And so I kind of joined that Japanese community they were foreign exchange students. So I kind of joined that community. They didn't know English very well. And so that was really great for my Japanese for a while, because I got to practice speaking Japanese with real life native speakers every day. And that was cool. But after a while, I started to get the sense that they weren't really viewing me the same way that they would view the other people in the group. I was this different kind of sort of a person. I was a foreigner. And sometimes they would invite me to parties when they were in the mood to be more international. But sometimes they would just want to have Japanese only parties, and they wouldn't invite me because I wasn't Japanese in their mind. And I don't totally blame them, because of course I wasn't fully functional as a Japanese person. My language ability was not to the level of a native speaker. There were lots of references I didn't know. I didn't fully understand the culture. But for me at the time, it just felt really off-putting, because it was like, man, I'm working so hard to try to meet you guys halfway and understand your culture, understand your language, yet you're still just putting me in this box of being a foreigner. Mm-hmm. And that really kind of frustrated me and made me feel like, why am I dedicating so much time and effort to this culture and to these people when, they're not going to meet me halfway at all, and they're still just going to treat me like a foreigner.
Yeah.
And so, like, really what happened was, I think I almost, in my mind, I had made this contract with Japan that said, hey, if I completely dedicate myself in my life to mastering Japanese, then in return, you will allow me to feel accepted and like I'm a part of something. Because that was what I was really craving when I was in high school and first got interested in Japanese culture. And I just decided that Japan agreed to this contract that I made, but really it was something I made up in my head. And so when I felt like the Japanese people didn't hold up their end of the contract, it was like I held up my end, I got really good at Japanese and stuff, but they didn't hold up their end. It felt like I had been betrayed. And so my love for Japan kind of became a sort of resentment. And it really got to the point where it was painful for me to spend time with Japanese, because it was just a reminder of like, crap, I spent so much of my life dedicated to these people and they didn't give me anything in return. They just left me in the dust. Mm-hmm. And so it was almost like part of my mind was so conflicted because it was like I dedicated so much to this thing, yet now I didn't know how I felt about it. So it was almost like there was this cognitive dissonance in my mind. In order to solve this cognitive dissonance, it almost tried to fully hate Japan. Because if I could just hate Japan, then I could just let go of all this baggage and be free and just start a new life. Because loving it and hating it at the same time was the most painful thing, being conflicted, right? Yeah. And fully loving it didn't seem like an option anymore because I'd already seen too much of what was going on within my psyche. Mm-hmm. So the other option just seemed to hate it. So I became hyper-focused on all the negative aspects of the culture and things like that. And it got really toxic. If you watch the video on my channel called Matt's AJAT Journey, that's this 3-hour-long monologue of me talking about my whole experience in learning Japanese and engaging with Japanese people, you can tell that I'm very bitter about my whole experience. And it was around this time in my life that I filmed that video, where it really just felt like, man, why this whole thing was just for nothing. And so after that point, I took some time away from Japanese and really focused on meditation, because that was the only thing that I was interested in that point, because I didn't have an opportunity to develop any other interests outside of Japanese for the longest time, because I was just doing Japanese all the time. And so I became interested in meditation around that time, and I didn't have anything else I wanted to do. So I kind of really dove deeply into that. And what that helped me realize was that, I was doing the opposite of what I was doing before. I was ignoring all the positive aspects of the culture and hyper-focusing on the negative aspects. And I had all these expectations. I thought that Japan owed me something, when in reality they didn't. And so through this, I was able to kind of take a step back and view all these negative emotions and negative thoughts I was having from a detached perspective, and realize that they weren't necessarily valid. And they weren't necessarily like me. It wasn't that I hate Japan. It's that, due to my past, negative thoughts are arising. And if you think about the causes and conditions, it's completely inevitable that I'm having these thoughts at this time. And I was able to kind of see, if I stop engaging with these thoughts and I kind of just let them play themselves out, then I can kind of burn through all this old baggage that I have built up related to Japan and eventually end up in a more neutral place. And so I had to go through this period of spending time in Japanese, letting all these negative emotions come up, all these conflicting emotions come up, and just view them and experience them fully, but not engage with them, not, really proliferate them. Yeah. And that was very difficult to do. And I never would have been able to really stick through that and get to the other side of that if I hadn't trained the ability to kind of objectively observe my experience through meditation. And so if it wasn't through meditation, I don't think I would be doing anything related to Japan right now. I probably still would just be very bitter and salty about the whole thing, because I would have just buried all those negative emotions. So from that sense, it was very crucial in a kind of indirect way, and not directly related to language learning. But related to language learning as well, it definitely helps that I have more control over my attention. And so I can say, like, okay, for the next hour, I'm going to only listen for pitch accent, and really have that be the center and have the meaning drop into the background a little bit. And that's really useful. And so, yeah, it definitely helps out in Japanese, but it helps out a lot more in Chinese, because for me, the act of consuming Chinese content is much more boring than the act of consuming Japanese content, because I understand so much less. So it's much more easy for my mind to just wander into thoughts about what I'm going to do tomorrow or what happened earlier today, and kind of just zone out and not really be fully present with the Chinese. But through meditating, I have the ability to see, the mind is starting to wander away, and then just bring it back and be more fully present. And so in a way, it is a lot like meditation, because you're now, instead of just being focused on the content of your experience, which would be the Chinese, you're focused on the content and the kind of structure. Part of your mind is focused on, what am I actually paying attention to right now? And that's the part of your mind that you're trying to cultivate with meditation. So it's definitely been very useful. And in a way, I can almost kill two birds with one stone, because I'm getting better at Chinese, and I'm getting better at being aware of how my mind is working and controlling that to a certain extent.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that sounds ridiculously useful, because I was just thinking last night when I was listening to some Swedish that I think the reason that I prefer to have a book and the accompanying audiobook when I read in French or Swedish is that otherwise I have a great deal of trouble stopping my thoughts just wandering off in English. So I'm listening to this Swedish, but actually I'm thinking about like, oh, I've got to make sure I get that set up for the video with Matt tomorrow, and I've got to do this, and like there's no actual Swedish going into my brain. It's going into my ears, but not my mental space. So where would you recommend that if people watching, including me, want to get started with meditation, where would we do that? This question, by the way, if Matt hesitates, this question wasn't on his run sheet.
Well, I'm hesitant to talk too much about this topic just because I very much consider myself someone who's still in the process of learning how to meditate. Like I'm constantly
that's actually
making
helpful.
beginner mistakes and just learning how my own mind works itself. And so there are people out there who have been meditating for 20 years, and have lived at a Buddhist monastery for 10 years. And so they're in a much better place to give advice. But what I've found is that for meditation, in many ways, is very different than almost every other kind of skill that we tend to cultivate and engage in. So for me in Japanese, what I would do is I would oftentimes, and I think this was one of the questions, like I'd make a game plan for how I was going to get better at Japanese over the next month, and I'd be very strategic about it. I'd say, okay, well, I need to get better at this thing, so I'm going to do this, and if I do this many new flashcards each day, then by this day I'll know this many words, and I kind of plan it all out and stuff like that. But if you approach meditation from that type of mindset of, I'm trying to get good at meditation, and I'm going to meditate this many hours each day, and I'm going to do this type of meditation so that by the time it's next year, this time I'm going to have this amount of meditative skill. That whole mindset is directly counter to the actual act of meditation, which is a lot. And meditation means a lot of things. There's a lot of different types of meditation, but like mindfulness meditation, which is mainly what I do, it's all about being present with whatever is happening right now and not necessarily trying to change whatever's happening, more just being able to be with it to a certain extent. Now, of course, there is a component of you're meditating because you want to get, you want to learn to understand your mind better. You want to become more aware. You want to gain more control over your attention. So obviously we're trying to get something out of this. But in the very moment that you are meditating, if that desire and that part of your mind that creates the strategic game plan sneaks in, then you're not going to be able to just observe what's happening. You're going to be constantly thinking about your meditation. You're going to be thinking about how well it's going instead of just being fully present with it. And for me, this is a lesson that I couldn't learn through reading about meditation or through talking to other people. I had to learn it in my own direct experience. I had to just bang my head against the wall over and over and over again, treating meditation the same way I treated Japanese, before I finally just cracked and realized this is never going to work. I need to just give up and once that happened, which was after like 2 years of trying to meditate, then I actually started to make some headway. And in a way, for me, the most useful kind of framework was to think of meditation as just sitting and doing nothing. And for me, sitting and doing nothing is very challenging because I kind of have ADHD and I like to be stimulated and I'm always just thinking about stuff. And so just sitting and doing nothing with no stimulation is actually very challenging. And so when I started thinking about it that way, as like meditation is cultivating the ability to sit and do nothing and feel okay with that, that was actually a more useful framework because it got me out of the mindset of like trying to get somewhere. So for me personally, that was very, very helpful. And I think and in addition to this was just starting small. Like the first 5 times I tried to meditate, I quickly tried to get up to 1 hour a day. And then I was meditating 1 hour a day, even though really that was way, way more than I could realistically handle. And so then after like 2 weeks of doing that, then I just stopped meditating and I meditated all for like a really long time. So starting small and being really consistent about that, like 10 minutes a day every morning, but actually doing that. Like it also took me a long time to get humble enough where I get serious about that goal. Because for me, it's like 10 minutes a day, that's nothing. I'm never going to reach my lofty meditation goals if I'm only doing that. So I would just do nothing instead, because it was like, oh, well, I can't do 1 hour a day until like next week when I'm going to finally have enough time. So I might as well just do nothing now. So it took me a long time to fully get over that mindset and be like, okay, I'm going to do 10 minutes a day and I'm going to be serious about it. And that was another key component of me starting to kind of pick it up. So I think if you want to like really add meditation to your life in a sustainable long-term way, then at the beginning I wouldn't really worry about technique at all. I would just think of it as like just sitting and doing nothing for a while and really just focus on building in the habit, making it a part of your daily routine, starting with maybe even 5 minutes a day too. And once you have a solid habit of doing it for like 5-10 minutes a day, you can grow that a little bit to like 20-30 minutes a day. And once you have that as a habit, you can start thinking more about techniques and things like that, because at that point it'll already be rooted enough in your life where the idea of trying to kind of like get better or get somewhere won't be as toxic. You'll be able to integrate a little bit more. And after that point, I would explore a lot of different kind of styles and methods, because there's a lot of different meditation teachers out there. They use different language and they explain things in a different way. And what's going to work best for you is going to depend on what type of mind you have, because we all have kind of different natural tendencies of our mind. But one other just last thing I'll say is that for me, the meditation instructions that appealed to me the most initially were actually not the most helpful, because the ones that appealed to me the most were the ones that were, you know, very structured, that had like levels and said, okay, you start at level 1, follow these instructions, then you'll get to level 2 and level 3, level 4, because that was what really, you know, that's what appealed to my mind, but that wasn't what I needed, right? Because I was already very strong on that aspect of my mind. I needed to be balanced out. Yeah. So it was only when I actually started doing the type of meditation that was really more in the line along the lines of like, yep, just notice whatever's happening. And if you notice that you want something to happen, then just drop that and, you know, just notice whatever's happening, essentially, right? Like that didn't sound as exciting to me, but it was when I actually started to do that I started to get actually kind of make more progress. So also just when you're exploring different types of teachers and methods, I'd keep that tendency of your mind that the thing that you need the most might not be the one that sounds the most appealing to you naturally.
Yeah. Yeah, and it sounds like from what you're saying that people are always going to try to achieve something. I think, I mean, this isn't an idea unique that like my idea, but I think the same thing happens with language learning, where we have this like internal manager who's like a real dickhead, basically, who's like always saying like, no, you need to do this. It needs to be better. Like if someone said, well, if you just do this much Japanese or this much Swedish for the next 2 years, then you will be at this level in 2 years' time. And like that's a rational approach where, and it might not be that high a level. It might be like, okay, B2, or, you know, you might be able to do this in the language. But people hear that and they're like, no, I want to be better than that. I want to do more. I want to be, like, I know that you've said on your channel that you were kind of taken in a little bit by AJAT, which said that, like, if you just do this hardcore enough for 18 months, you will sound like a native after 18 months. And you had this unhealthy idea that if you didn't do that, if you failed at doing that after, you know, if you failed to become fluent in Japanese after 18 months, then that made you like a loser.
Yeah.
And I think that's like, there's this internal manager, at least there is for me, and I think there is for a lot of people, who's always saying like, no, you need to be better than what is actually humanly possible.
Yeah, totally. And so a lot of meditation is basically learning to see that part of your mind and not engage with it and let it just be there and just see it as, oh, the mind's being the mind. That's what the mind does, and not really buying into it, which is actually so much harder than it might sound when you first hear it. And it goes beyond just there's that part of the mind that probably people who like to watch our content share as well, that part of the mind that always is trying to strive to get better and more competent, always reaching for something greater in the future. But there's other parts of your mind that just want to go on Twitter all day, or, you know, just like binge watch Netflix all day, or like eat unhealthy food, just the kind of animalistic desires. And ultimately those are overcome in the same way, right? Just being able to see those desires and allow them to be there, because that's just part of being human, right? We have those desires. If you try to suppress them, that's not going to be healthy. So letting them be there, experiencing them, but not engaging with them and not letting them control you. And actually one thing I will say on just how to think about meditation, like I've been on 3 meditation retreats now at this point. And the second one that I went on, which is about a year ago, It was the 7-day meditation retreat where, like, they call it a meditation retreat, and retreat gives you this kind of idea that it's like this spa vacation, but it's actually quite hardcore, where for 7 days you basically do nothing but meditate all day every day. Like, you go to this facility where you have lodging, and like I was at this pretty nice facility, so you go there, they take your phone, you're not allowed to have any books, you're not allowed to like have a journal, so there's no writing, no reading, and there's no talking to people. There's actually, they even say no eye contact, because it's really no communication, so that because you don't get sucked into the social part of your mind, right? It's the idea is to just be introspecting. And so for 7 days, it was just me sitting alone with my mind ultimately and meditating all day. And it was by far the hardest thing that I've ever done. Like, a couple hours in, I was like, there's no way I'm gonna make it. I need to go home. This is awful. And so in a way, it was just like this going through withdrawal of all the little addictions we have in modern life, right? Like, I think everyone has a lot of these little addictions. Like, we're all a little bit addicted to social media, and a little bit addicted to like talking to our friends, and a little bit addicted to, watching movies or whatever our hobbies are. And so I would have all these cravings come up, like, I want to watch a movie so bad right now, or like, I want to go eat this food so bad right now. And I'd have to find a way to just be okay without fulfilling that desire. And I think that's kind of the point of rehab, right? Is that it forces you to somehow find a way to be okay in light of you wanting to do this thing that you can't do. And by the end of that week, it wasn't necessarily that I'd gotten that much better at meditation, but just the fact that I had to sit here and just watch my desires arise and pass away for so long, it built up my willpower muscle, and I've just permanently had significantly more willpower after that experience than I did before the experience. And it made it much more easier to make changes in my life, because it was like I was forced to figure out how to just do the thing that I wanted to do and not give in to that desire. And I don't think I ever would have been able to achieve that if I didn't go on the retreat, because that environment was crucial. I would have just given up so much sooner if I was just at home and could have easily went and turned on the computer or did something like that. But what it made me realize is that a big thing of what you're training in meditation is the ability to be okay just sitting and doing nothing. Because when you think about it, if let's say you're studying your target language and you get a desire to stop and go do something more stimulating or more fun, it's basically because you feel like the act of studying your target language isn't enough to make you feel okay, to make you feel like fully, like everything's good enough. So you need to add something on top of it, right? And so when you're just sitting and doing nothing, that's even less stimulating than studying a language, right? So it's very quickly, it might sound easy to sit and do nothing, but very quickly you're just attacked by all these desires to go and become stimulated. And so if you think of meditation as just the process of being comfortable doing nothing, that's really powerful, because if you're comfortable doing nothing, then anything above nothing is going to be stimulating and interesting, right? So then if your baseline is that you feel great when you're sitting and doing nothing, then when you study a language, that's going to be very interesting and nice and engaging. And it's going to be easy to not feel like you need to add something stimulating on top of that, like listening to music in the background or stopping to check social media and other stuff. So I think willpower ultimately boils down to the ability to be okay sitting and doing nothing in a certain way.
Wow. Okay. That went deep. I really like that. Now, just I have tried to get into meditation before, and it's not that I did it too hardcore. I actually started off with like a very like layman's kind of book that just explained it and everything. It's probably more just that I didn't build the habit, but I'm really like motivated now to go and kind of try it out, because it sounds like it just would have all these benefits for like everything in your life. And like for me, language learning is like probably comes a little bit more naturally these days, but not for that, just for other things I don't want to do and other things that don't stimulate me or whatever. It sounds like it just has an effect through all aspects from what you're saying.
Yeah, totally. Like, it's shown me a different perspective on life, where when I think about my old perspective on life, it was basically this perspective of getting through the stuff that I didn't like so that I could get to the stuff that I did like. And life inevitably contains a lot of stuff that you don't like that much, right? Like doing the dishes or talking to people you don't like, aspects of work that you don't like. And so in a way, that's kind of a sad way to live your life, of just trying to get through significant portions of your life, just, somehow drudge through it. And so meditation provides this perspective of that the true quality of your experience is more determined by your internal stance, your internal kind of posture in a way. And so instead you can strive to try to find a way to experience well-being regardless of what the content of your current experience is. And so in a way I try to, when I find myself falling into that pattern of trying to get through something so I can get to the next thing, of realizing like, this is my life, right? This is, I'm going to die one day. This is part of my life. I don't want to just kind of write this off, try to get through it. Like I'm alive right now. I'm conscious, and try to fully experience that and get out of that mindset of trying to get through it.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, wait, this is going to seem a bit ridiculous now because we've gone like deep on almost like the meaning of life, but and now we're going back to flashcards. So I don't think I'm wrong in saying that you found flashcards to be one of the cornerstones of your Japanese learning. To what extent do you, and I know it's a bit unfair to ask you this because I don't think you've seriously studied a European language, but to what extent do you think that this is because Japanese is made of characters that are completely undecipherable to English speakers, and the way that Japanese constructs meaning, from what I've read anyway, is like totally different? Do you think flashcards might be less efficient, or a less efficient way to spend your time in a language like French, where the meaning can be guessed or somewhat inferred for an English speaker?
Yeah, well, like you said, I don't have really any real experience with European languages, so I'm more just speaking out of speculation. So I just want to preface it with that. But I definitely think that it probably is the case that flashcards are less efficient overall when you're talking about learning a language that's, like a European language, assuming you're an English speaker, as compared to learning Japanese as an English speaker. And one way to think about this is that the better you get at a foreign language, the easier it is to learn new words. So it's kind of this trade-off where at the beginning of learning a foreign language, you're learning the most common words, which are very high value because the most common words show up all the time. But it's hard to learn those words because you're not used to the sound system and you have no real mental hooks to kind of attach to these words. And then as you're getting better, you're learning words that are less common. You hear them less often. They don't add as much value to your experience by learning them, but all native speakers know them, so you kind of have to know them as well. But the trade-off is that picking up new words gets very easy at that point. So because you have so much infrastructure in your mind related to that language. And so eventually it gets to a point where you're so comfortable with the language and learning new words is so easy that it's just unnecessary to use flashcards, because you basically just by looking it up once, or maybe you don't even have to look it up, maybe you just can infer the meaning from context, then that's enough for you to pick it up. And so why go out of your way to make a flashcard and review that flashcard when just being with the target language would already be enough for you to retain the memory of the word? And, in our native language, we're learning new words all the time. Usually it's not even a conscious process. So obviously we don't need flashcards at that point. So the way that I think about it is that if we have like how easy it is to learn new words, be from a scale of like 1 to 10 in the language, and 10 means it's super easy to learn a new word. You just pick them up left and right unconsciously just through immersing, like we experience in our native language. Then I think you start off higher on that scale automatically when you're learning a European language, right? Like maybe you start off at a 5, whereas in Japanese you start off at a 1. And so when you're at that 1, flashcards are extremely valuable because otherwise you just keep forgetting and it's so hard to lock them in. Whereas at a 5, might be easy enough without the flashcard system. But I would still it would seem to me that it'd still be useful to use something like Anki, like a spaced repetition system, at the beginning of the process in learning a European language, so that you can just kind of jumpstart your learning, maybe quickly memorize the most common 2,000 words. But relatively early on, you're probably going to feel like you can just drop the flashcard system because just through immersion, you can continue to learn words at a really good pace. Whereas in Japanese, it's going to take you a lot longer to get to the point where you feel comfortable with that. And ultimately, I do feel like I've reached that point with Japanese. Like, I don't do flashcards in Japanese anymore, and I still am regularly learning words. And I feel like it's the type of thing where most of the time, when I look up a new word, that will be enough for me to remember it for like over a year going forward, just from that one instance. So,
yeah. Well, it's funny. I have conflicting thoughts about this. I feel like I didn't do any kind of formal study for French at the beginning. I used, I don't know if you know the Michel Thomas method.
I know of it, haven't
so
really explored it that much, but
yeah, so it only really works for languages reasonably close to English because, and I do think it works well for those because he basically just says like, in French, you don't wait for someone, you attendre them, like you attend to them, even though you're actually waiting for them, and so you don't wait for them, you await them, and so if it's like je vous attends, that means I am waiting for you, and it's like straight away. I mean, you'll probably remember that for like the next couple of minutes just on that, and then he just builds that on top and just says like, so I am waiting for you because, and then he has like this mnemonic for like all your little joining words like because, I am waiting for you because you are running late or something, and it just sort of builds up like that, and after like a couple of hours you've actually got a fair bank of like common words, he and she, and grammar, because he's saying like it's not I await you, it's I you await kind of thing. So and that was pretty much my introduction to French, and then from there I just went to like basic like kids kind of content and repetitive listening, and even not that long after that I got into Harry Potter. It's like I already know the stories, so I could just listen. And but I would actually say that now is when I'm feeling the need for flashcards, because it wasn't that hard to learn all that like beginning stuff, but now that stuff is coming up so much less often, like the word for like front door or something, it's still important to know. You're not really fluent in French if you can't say front door, but you're not going to hear it very often. It might come up once in a whole novel or something like that. So now it's like that I maybe have a vocab of like 3,000 in French and I want to build that to like 10,000. It's kind of now that I'm feeling like
yeah, I could see that.
Could use flashcards now.
That's pretty like, interesting. Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
So that kind of ties into my next question, which is that, and this is going to be to varying degrees for different languages, but would you agree that learning a fair chunk of vocab and grammar, enough to say pass a B2 exam, is pretty negligible compared to learning the language up to a native like proficiency, like a proficiency, the kind of proficiency that you've learned Japanese to? Learning what you need to know to just pass an exam and seem like you know a fair bit about that language is pretty negligible to sounding like we do in English, because of just all those things were mentioned, like flowing on words like don't you want to go, and even just little like the way we use certain words that is not technically their meaning, like I got this yesterday, really like you received this yesterday, but like you'll hear a lot of non-native English speakers will say like, oh, I received it from him, and we're just like, we would never say that, just say I got it. And so because that's such a small part, actually I'll let you answer that first. Would you say that that's the case?
Yeah, well, first I just kind of want to address what you're talking about, how you feel like now that you're at an intermediate level in French, the flashcards might actually become more useful. Like, that actually made a lot of sense, and it made me reflect on my experience learning Japanese. And I definitely took the flashcards much further than most people seem to. Like, most people seem to, even people who are very into flashcards, eventually reach some point when they're like, okay, I'm comfortable enough that I'm just going to just go fly solo in a way, treat it the same way I treat my native language, and not be actively using some sort of system to learn new words and things like that. But I kept my like formal learning system in place for a very long time, to the point where I was using flashcards to learn words that even many native speakers don't know. And I often wonder whether this was a good decision or if in a way this was a bad decision. And I kind of go back and forth on it, because in a way it does seem like the fact that I did make so many flashcards for all these obscure words really did help me efficiently get my vocabulary to, or at least my passive vocabulary, to a near native level, because I had a flashcard for front door, right? And for all these other super specific things. And who knows how long it would have taken me to acquire that naturally just through consuming content, right? Like it takes native speakers 15 plus years to learn all of those little words naturally through this exposure. So I was able to, like within 5 years, catch up and surpass the average native my age in just vocabulary, because I learned 10 words every single day, which is actually a lot if you're doing that consistently.
Yeah.
And that's just with the flashcards. I was probably also learning some stuff outside of the flashcards as well. And so maybe you're right on that one, that there is a utility lasting a lot longer. I mean, still, I think it eventually gets to the point where I'm at now with Japanese, where I'm so comfortable that it is easy for me to learn a new word. And it's pretty rare that I come across a new word, that the fact that I've come across a new word itself makes it memorable, right? Because it's like, oh, wow, that's interesting. What is the reason why I hadn't come across this earlier? And things like that. But of course, that was like after 5 years of regularly using flashcards. So I just wanted to kind of say that is interesting to kind of explore, and maybe it's not so different in a European language. Maybe you're right.
Yeah, so the question leading on from that is that do you feel like maybe the Asian languages, or the languages that are completely unlike English, have a reputation, maybe an unfair reputation, of being harder than they really are because of that initial, like, they're so much harder initially, but actually in the long run, to if you really want to reach like a native like proficiency, it's actually pretty negligible in like how hard the first stages are, because they're not really what's most of the work.
I mean, again, this is hard to say because I only have experience trying to reach a near native level in one language, which is Japanese. So if I also had the experience of doing it in a European language, it'd probably be easier for me to make a fair comparison. But I can definitely see that, yeah, probably there is a kind of the perception of European languages being easy to learn is somewhat artificial, in the sense that it's assuming that you only want to get to a kind of crappy level. Because basically what most people try to do when they try to learn a language is train themselves to think in their native language and then use grammar formulas and vocabulary that they've memorized to translate their English thought into the target language. Now, in Japanese or Chinese, or a language that's fundamentally completely different than your native language, this just doesn't work. Like, you can try, but it's really, you're going to hit a very hard limit very quickly. Whereas if you're learning a European language, they're close enough that you can actually get a decent amount of success using this method. Because if you just take an English thought and kind of swap out all the words with like Spanish words, it'll probably be a somewhat coherent Spanish sentence that they can kind of understand. And so in this sense, if you're just trying to get to this crappy level where you're still functioning from the place of mostly just translating your thoughts into the other target language, then it's way easier to learn a European language than a language that's completely different than your native language. But yeah, if you're talking about getting to a near native level, then this whole structure, like this whole, I guess, approach to learning the language is not going to be applicable, because you have to know ahead of time exactly how native speakers in the target language express whatever they express, right? Like, there's going to be a lot of little differences. So like, one difference I talk about a lot in Japanese is how in English we say, I need to go to the bathroom. That's like the most common way of expressing that you need to go to the bathroom. Whereas in Japanese, they say the literal equivalent of I want to go to the bathroom. So if you're taking that first approach I explained of thinking in English and translating your thoughts into Japanese, you can say the Japanese literal equivalent of I need to go to the bathroom, and they'll probably understand you, but you're going to sound kind of unnatural. And the only way for you to be able to speak Japanese like a Japanese person is for you to actually observe how Japanese people speak and learn through that observation that Japanese people actually say, I want to go to the bathroom, and then mimic that. And you have to basically do this on a like concept by concept basis, where for every single idea that can be commonly expressed in the language, you have to know how native speakers of that language tend to express it. And this is going to be the same even for European languages, because when you get to the highest level, there's still going to be tons of little differences. And there's you're not going to be able to get away with just saying it how you would say it in English, but in the target language, because even though they'll understand you, lots of times that's going to end up making you deviate from the way that an actual native speaker would express the idea. So yeah, in a way, when you're talking about truly getting to a native-like level, because you have to end up going to that place of functioning on a concept per concept basis and just mimicking every single individual little thing, of course, I think the difficulty is going to be more comparable between whether you're learning an Asian language or a very different language or a similar language. But still, I think that ultimately the Asian language or the very different language is going to be harder to reach that level, because a lot of things, from what I've heard, like between French and English or German and English or Spanish and English, a lot of times the way that an idea would be expressed oftentimes is very similar. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's not, but a lot of times it is. So in a way, the what you're doing internally is, like, we could say you're memorizing when it's the same and when it's different. Yeah. And when it's the same, that's easier to remember, because you're basically just, instead of remembering every single individual word in the pattern or something, you're just remembering same as English, what I would have expected. Yeah. And so in a way, you're memorizing what I expected and what broke my expectations, mm-hmm. which is overall less total information than having every single thing break your expectations. Yeah. So in Japanese, every single little thing is going to be completely different. Not literally, but most things are going to be fundamentally different from the way they would be in English. And so the total amount you have to learn in order to be at the native level is larger, because the actual distance between your native language and the target language is literally greater. Yeah. And so, yeah, I still think it's going to be more different. And also, I think that when you're talking about getting to a near native level in a language like Japanese, the real difficulty is training your brain to fundamentally think like a Japanese person's brain thinks, because at a very base level, the way that they stack concepts to express higher level ideas is very different. Yeah. And it's completely possible to basically think in the way that an English speaker thinks in Japanese and express that in somewhat natural Japanese, but you'll kind of sound the way that, like, dubbed characters in a movie sound, because like, although you're using natural vocabulary and collocations and pronunciations, ultimately a Japanese person is still going to sense that it's like, you don't think the same way we do. You're like thinking in this weird kind of foreign sounding way, and getting over that to the point where you actually have the types of thoughts that Japanese people have, which is almost beyond the level of actually the actual syntax and structure and usage of the language, is so difficult. Mm-hmm. And I think that's less of a challenge when you're going from one European language to another, because at a very base level, the way that they think is actually very similar, because the language is actually derived from the same root. Yeah. So. Yeah.
That's really sort of what you're saying. Kind of reminds me of the movie Arrival. I don't know if you've seen. It's like, it's such a different way of thinking that it actually, like, changes. Like, I'm not going to spoil the movie. It changes everything about the way this woman lives her life. And yeah, I guess I would, and like, I was really only playing devil's advocate, kind of suggesting that European languages might be just as hard as Asian languages. I don't think that at all. But I guess I would say that sometimes that can make it harder in a way, because there are all these things you can say in French and Swedish and presumably Spanish and German that, like, if you just swap in the grammar that those languages have and swap in the vocabulary, that is right. And it's right, and even somewhat idiomatic. Like, as in, it's not like, it's not one of those things that, like, yeah, technically you can say that, but we never would. It's more a case of, like, well, 10% of the time we would say that, but probably only 10% of the time that corresponds to 10% of situations. But what you should have said, we're in a 90% situation where you should have actually said this, which is, that's like the one that's foreign to us English speakers. Like, in French, you, instead of saying, like, it's my pleasure, when someone says thank you, you say je t'en prie. And I'm just going to freely admit that I have no idea what that means. It means something to do with I am it is my pleasure of you or something. I don't know. It's got the word I and you in it, and that's it. That's all I know. But you say je t'en prie. You don't say like. But you could say ça fait un plaisir or un plaisir or something like that. And if assuming I had said it correctly, which I didn't, it would be also correct. But it would they would have that thought of like, but you say that too much. Like you say that so much that it's weird. And that's when you think about your experience of non-native English speakers, they often do say these words that like it was right the first time because it was just once. But now you've said it like 10 times in the last hour, it's getting weird. So I'd say that like, yeah, European languages can, obviously they're easier overall, but they can kind of lull you into that false sense of security because no one's ever going to correct you on something that is actually correct. There's nothing to correct you on. It doesn't mean that they don't have these thoughts though.
Like I could definitely see that as a tendency, but I don't think it's something that's insurmountable because like it is true with Japanese, very quickly you end up developing this awareness. If you're someone who's serious about trying to reach a native like level, you very quickly develop this awareness that you can't assume anything.
Yeah.
And it actually, even for Japanese learners, now that I actually am thinking about it, it takes a while for learners to fully cultivate this awareness because there are certain things that if you are monolingual, you just take for granted. Like you don't realize that a certain feature of the way that we speak English is completely arbitrary and that it could be different, right? There's really things like it might be hard for people to at the beginning to notice that it's arbitrary that we say the word need when we say I need to go to the bathroom, right? Maybe maybe it just seems like of course it's need, it has to be because that's the idea I want to express. Like actually, I was talking to my aunt the other day who she's learning Russian, and she was talking about how she was doing this language exchange and she wanted to say. I want to go and see the sun because it's been cloudy. And she said that she literally said, I wanted to see the sun. And the Russian person was like, oh, well, we don't say that. And thought that she meant something else. And she's like, no, I literally meant I want to see the sun. And she's like, okay, well then I guess that's correct, but it still sounds weird.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, you didn't really want to see the sun. You wanted to experience good weather. Yeah. Right? Just in English, we say seeing... We call experiencing good weather seeing the sun. It wasn't that you literally wanted to see what the sun looked like. Yeah. So, and then she was like, oh, you're right. So sometimes it can be hard to take a step back and think, what is the base idea I want to express separate from the way I would express that in English? So even in Japanese, it can be hard to fully cultivate this because you have to really train yourself to realize that you can take nothing for granted. Like even the fact that Japanese people express a certain idea at all, like it might not be the case. So until you've seen something with your own two eyes or your own two ears multiple times from multiple different people, you cannot assume that something is going to be correct or going to be natural. Yeah. But it's definitely, I would assume, harder to cultivate this awareness in a European language because you get away with lacking this awareness to a greater extent. But I think just if someone was, maybe someone's just by listening to this conversation, they can start to realize, oh, I understand what they're talking about. I better watch out for this and slowly cultivate this awareness and learn to, even though maybe 9 times out of 10, your initial guess was right, you are aware of what is a guess and what needs to be verified and what you're actually certain of because you've heard native speakers say that many times. Yeah. And I think keeping that division in your head is an important part of being a good language learner. And in a way, you almost have to develop these like OCD like tendencies where you're always second guessing yourself and you're always looking for potential errors in your knowledge because that's really what it takes if you want to get as close to a native like level as possible. Yeah. I've forgotten what I was just going to say. Oh yeah. So I guess it sounds like what we're agreeing on is the idea that it's like in Japanese and probably Chinese and maybe even Arabic and some other languages that I don't know, Cantonese, and the way of thinking is so different that it's not even just a matter of like mimicking a whole lot of idioms. Like even if you had a perfect memory and you could just go, okay, I know that idiom now and I'm never going to forget it and I'll just repeat it whenever it's necessary. That doesn't actually train your brain to like reformat itself to
to think like a Japanese person. So it sounds like it's harder in that you're basically building a new brain, whereas in French or Spanish, like even if you're getting to like a very high level, you can kind of make an annex to the brain you have in English. You can kind of build on top of that, but it's almost like you've got a second brain in a totally different language.
Yeah, and one other thing that I could say is we use the word like it's harder to do that in Japanese, which of course we all know what we mean. But another way to say it is like it just takes longer.
Yeah,
because fundamentally it's the same process, right? It just takes longer for your brain to get used to it.
Yeah, like running a marathon is harder than running 10 kilometers, even though actually the 10-kilometer one is definitely more painful. Like if any runners are watching, they will agree with me that the 10 kilometers hurts more because you have to run so much faster that it just hurts your lungs. But I don't think 10-kilometer runners would seriously argue that what they do is harder. It's like it just kind of it hurts more at the time, I guess.
That was a lot of fun. Sorry if I took too long answering some of the questions.
Apologizing for like giving me too much really good content and like just a lot of stuff that I'm personally going to be thinking a lot about. It's very Japanese kind of tendency you seem to have built, like very polite. So I just want to thank Matt for doing this today. And giving us all his insights into language learning and meditation and everything. It's been really good. If you somehow know of my channel but you don't know of Matt's channel, make sure to check him out, Matt versus Japan, and the mass immersion approach that he's building with a friend who goes online as yoga. So check that out, and thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time. Bye.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me on. It was fun.
Thanks, Matt.